Chapter 3 Part 2 of the Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of H.M.S. Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of H.M.S. Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 3, Part 2 The Mutiny. Every one of these circumstances, and many others which might be stated from Mr. Morrison's journal, are omitted in Bligh's published narrative, but many of them are alluded to in his original journal, and others that prove distinctly the constant reproofs to which his officers were subject, and the bad terms on which they stood with their commander. A few extracts from this journal will sufficiently establish this point. In so early a part of the voyage as their arrival in Adventure Bay, he found fault with his officers, and put the carpenter into confinement. Again at Matavia Bay, on the 5th December, Bligh says, I ordered the carpenter to cut a large stone that was brought off by one of the natives, requesting me to get it made fit for them to grind their hatchets on. But to my astonishment he refused, in direct terms, to comply, saying, I will not cut the stone, for it will spoil my chisel, and though there may be law to take away my clothes, there is none to take away my tools. This man having been shown his mutinous and insolent behaviour, I was under the necessity of confining him to his cabin. On the 5th January 3 men deserted in the cutter, on which occasion Bligh says, had the mate of the watch been awake, no trouble of this kind would have happened. I have therefore disrated and turned him before the mast. Such neglectful and worthless petty officers, I believe, never were in a ship as are in this. No orders for a few hours together are obeyed by them, and their conduct in general is so bad, that no confidence or trust can be reposed in them. In short, they have driven me to every thing but corporal punishment, and that must follow if they do not improve. By Morrison's journal it would appear that corporal punishment was not long delayed, for on the very day, he says, the midshipman was put in irons and confined from the 5th January to the 23rd March, 11 weeks. On the 17th January, orders being given to clear out the sail room and to air the sails, many of them were found very much mildewed and rotten in many places, on which he observes, if I had any officers to supersede the master and boatswain, or was capable of doing without them, considering them as common seamen, they should no longer occupy their respective stations. Scarcely any neglect of duty can equal the criminality of this. On the 24th January, the 3 deserters were brought back and flogged, then put in chains for further punishment. As this affair, he says, was solely caused by the neglect of the officers who had the watch, I was induced to give them all a lecture on this occasion, and endeavour to show them that, however exempt they were at present from the like punishment, yet they were equally subject, by the Articles of War, to a condign one. He then tells them that it is only necessity that makes him have recourse to reprimand, because there are no means of trying them by court-martial, and adds a remark, not very intelligible, but what he calls an unpleasant one, about such offenders having no feelings of honour or sense of shame. On the 7th March, a native Otaheitan, whom Bligh had confined in irons, contrived to break the lock of the Bilboa bolt and make his escape. I had given, says Bligh, a written order that the mate of the watch was to be answerable for the prisoners, and to visit and see that they were safe in his watch, but I have such a neglectful set about me, that I believe nothing but condign punishment can alter their conduct. Verbal orders, in the course of a month, were so forgotten, that they would impudently assert no such thing or directions were given. And I have been at last under the necessity to trouble myself with writing what by decent young officers would be complied with as the common rules of the service. Sir Stewart was the mate of the watch. These extracts show the terms on which Bligh was with his officers, and these few instances, with others from Morrison's journal, make it pretty clear, that though Christian, as fiery and passionate a youth as his commander could well be, and with feelings too acute to bear the foul and opprobrious language constantly addressed to him, was the sole instigator of the mutiny, the captain had no support to expect, and certainly received none, from the rest of his officers. That Christian was the sole author appears still more strongly from the following passage in Morrison's journal. When Mr. Bligh found he must go into the boat, he begged of Mr. Christian to desist, saying, "I'll pawn my honour, I'll give my bond, Mr. Christian, never to think of this if you'll desist," and urged his wife and family. To which Mr. Christian replied, "No, Captain Bligh, if you had any honour, things had not come to this; and if you had any regard for your wife and family, you should have thought on them before, and not behaved so much like a villain." Lieutenant Bligh again attempted to speak, but was ordered to be silent. The boatswain also tried to pacify Mr. Christian, to whom he replied, "It is too late. I have been in hell for this fortnight past, and am determined to bear it no longer; and you know, Mr. Cole, that I have been used like a dog all the voyage." It is pretty evident, therefore, that the mutiny was not, as Bligh in his narrative states it to have been, the result of a conspiracy. It will be seen by the minutes of the court martial that the whole affair was planned and executed between the hours of 4 and 8 o'clock on the morning of the 28th April, when Christian had the watch upon deck; that Christian, unable longer to bear the abusive and insulting language, had meditated his own escape from the ship the day before, choosing to trust himself to fate, rather than submit to the constant upbraiding to which he had been subject, but the unfortunate business of the cocoa nuts drove him to the commission of the rash and felonious act, which ended, as such criminal acts usually do, in his own destruction, and that of a great number of others, many of whom were wholly innocent. Lieutenant Bligh, like most passionate men, whose unruly tempers get the better of their reason, having vented his rage about the cocoa nuts, became immediately calm, and by inviting Christian to sup with him that same evening, evidently wished to renew their friendly intercourse, and happy would it have been for all parties had he accepted the invitation. On the same night, towards 10 o'clock, when the master had the watch, Bligh came on deck, as was his custom before retiring to sleep. It was one of those calm and beautiful nights, so frequent in tropical regions, whose soothing influence can be appreciated only by those who have felt it, when after a scorching day, the air breathes a most refreshing coolness. It was an evening of this sort, when Bligh for the last time came upon deck in the capacity of commander. A gentle breeze scarcely rippled the water, and the moon, then in its first quarter, shed its soft light along the surface of the sea. The short and quiet conversation that took place between Bligh and the master on this evening, after the irritation of the morning had subsided, only to burst forth again in all the horrors of mutiny and piracy, recalls to one's recollection that beautiful passage of Shakespeare, where on the evening of the murder, Duncan, on approaching the castle of Macbeth, observes to Banquo, "The air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses," etc. A passage which Sir Joshua Reynolds considers as a striking instance of what in painting is termed repose. The subject, he says, of this quiet and easy conversation gives that repose so necessary to the mind after the tumultuous bustle of the preceding scenes, and beautifully contrasts the scene of terror that immediately succeeds. While on this lovely night Bligh and his master were congratulating themselves on the pleasing prospect of fine weather and a full moon to light them through endeavour's dangerous straits, the unhappy and deluded Christian was, in all probability, brooding over his wrongs, and meditating on the criminal act he was to perpetrate the following morning, for he has himself stated that he had just fallen asleep about half after 3 in the morning, and was much out of order. The evidence on the court martial is sufficiently explicit as to the mode in which this act of piracy was committed. By the journal of James Morrison, the following is the account of the transaction, as given by Christian himself to the 2 midshipmen, Heywood and Stewart, both of whom had been kept below, the moment they were allowed to come upon deck, after the boat in which were Bligh and his companions had been turned adrift. He said that, finding himself much hurt by the treatment he had received from Lieutenant Bligh, he had determined to quit the ship the preceding evening, and had informed the boatswain, carpenter, and 2 midshipmen, Stewart and Hayward, of his intention to do so, that by them he was supplied with part of a roasted pig, some nails, beads, and other articles of trade, which he put into a bag that was given him by the last named gentleman; that he put this bag into the clew of Robert Tinkler's hammock, where it was discovered by that young gentleman when going to bed at night, but the business was smothered, and passed off without any further notice. He said he had fastened some staves to a stout plank, with which he intended to make his escape, but finding he could not effect it during the first and middle watches, as the ship had no way through the water, and the people were all moving about, he laid down to rest about 3:30 in the morning. That when Mr. Stewart called him to relieve the deck at 4 o'clock, he had but just fallen asleep, and was much out of order. Upon observing which, Mr. Stewart strenuously advised him to abandon his intention; that as soon as he had taken charge of the deck, he saw Mr. Hayward, the mate of his watch, lie down on the arm chest to take a nap, and finding that Mr. Hallett, the other midshipman, did not make his appearance, he suddenly formed the resolution of seizing the ship. Disclosing his intention to Matthew Quintal and Isaac Martin, both of whom had been flogged by Lieutenant Bligh, they called up Charles Churchill, who had also tasted the cat, and Matthew Thompson, both of whom readily joined in the plot. That Alexander Smith, alias John Adams, John Williams, and William McCoy evinced equal willingness, and went with Churchill to the armourer, of whom they obtained the keys of the arm chest, under pretence of wanting a musket to fire at a shark, then alongside. That finding Mr. Hallett asleep on an arm chest in the main hatchway, they roused and sent him on deck. Charles Norman, unconscious of their proceedings, had in the meantime awaked Mr. Hayward, and directed his attention to the shark, whose movements he was watching at the moment that Mr. Christian and his confederates came up the fore hatchway, after having placed arms in the hands of several men who were not aware of their design. One man, Matthew Thompson, was left in charge of the chest, and he served out arms to Thomas Burkitt and Robert Lamb. Mr. Christian said he then proceeded to secure Lieutenant Bligh, the master, gunner, and botanist. When Mr. Christian, observes Morrison in his journal, related the above circumstances, I recollected having seen him fasten some staves to a plank lying on the larboard gangway, as also having heard the boatswain say to the carpenter, "It will not do to night." I likewise remembered that Mr. Christian had visited the fore cockpit several times that evening, although he had very seldom, if ever, frequented the warrant officers' cabins before. If this be a correct statement, and the greater part of it is borne out by evidence on the court-martial, it removes every doubt of Christian being the sole instigator of the mutiny, and that no conspiracy nor preconcerted measures had any existence, but that it was suddenly conceived by a hot-headed young man in a state of great excitement of mind, amounting to a temporary aberration of intellect, caused by the frequent abusive and insulting language of his commanding officer. Waking out of a short half-hour's disturbed sleep, to take the command of the deck, finding the two mates of the watch, Hayward and Hallett, asleep, for which they ought to have been dismissed the service instead of being, as they were, promoted, the opportunity tempting, and the ship completely in his power, with a momentary impulse he darted down the fore hatchway, got possession of the keys of the arm chest, and made the hazardous experiment of arming such of the men as he thought he could trust, and effected his purpose. There is a passage in Captain Beechey's account of Pitcairn Island, which, if correct, would cast a stain on the memory of the unfortunate Stewart, who, if there was one innocent man in the ship, was that man. Captain Beechey says, speaking of Christian, his plan, strange as it must appear for a young officer to adopt, who was fairly advanced in an honourable profession, was to set himself adrift upon a raft, and make his way to the island Tofoa, then in sight. As quick in the execution as in the design, the raft was soon constructed, various useful articles were got together, and he was on the point of launching it, when a young officer, who afterwards perished in the Pandora, to whom Christian communicated his intention, recommended him, rather than risk his life on so hazardous an expedition, to endeavour to take possession of the ship, which he thought would not be very difficult, as many of the ship's company were not well disposed towards the commander, and would all be very glad to return to Otaheite, and reside among their friends in that island. This daring proposition is even more extraordinary than the premeditated scheme of his companion, and if true, certainly relieves Christian from part of the odium which has hitherto attached to him as the sole instigator of the mutiny. Relieve him? Not a jot. But on the best authority it may boldly be stated that it is not true, the authority of Stewart's friend and messmate, the late Captain Heywood. Captain Beechey, desirous of being correct in his statement, very properly sent his chapter on Pitcairn's Island for any observations Captain Heywood might have to make on what was said therein regarding the mutiny; observing in his note which accompanied it, that this account received from Adams differed materially from a footnote in Marshall's naval biography, to which Captain Heywood returned the following reply: 5th April, 1830. Dear Sir, I have perused the account you received from Adams of the mutiny in the Bounty, which does indeed differ very materially from a footnote in Marshall's naval biography by the editor, to whom I verbally detailed the facts, which are strictly true. That Christian informed the boatswain and the carpenter, Messrs. Heywood and Stewart, of his determination to leave the ship upon a raft, on the night preceding the mutiny, is certain; but that any one of them, Stewart in particular, should have recommended, rather than risk his life on so hazardous an expedition, that he should try the expedient of taking the ship from the captain, etc., is entirely at variance with the whole character and conduct of the latter, both before and after the mutiny, as well as with the assurance of Christian himself, the very night he quitted Tahiti, that the idea of attempting to take the ship had never entered his distracted mind until the moment he relieved the deck and found his mate and midshipmen asleep.
Note 7.
At that last interview with Christian he also communicated to me, for the satisfaction of his relations, other circumstances connected with that unfortunate disaster, which after their deaths may or may not be laid before the public; and although they can implicate none but himself, either living or dead, they may extenuate but will contain not a word of his in defense of the crime he committed against the laws of his country. I am, etc., P. Heywood. Captain Beechey stated only what he had heard from old Adams, who was not always correct in the information he gave to the visitors of his island; but this part of his statement gave great pain to Heywood, who adverted to it on his deathbed, wishing, out of regard for Stewart's memory and his surviving friends, that it should be publicly contradicted, and with this view the above reply of Captain Heywood is here inserted. The temptations, therefore, which it was supposed Otaheite held out to the deluded men of the Bounty, had no more share in the transaction than the supposed conspiracy. It does not appear, indeed, that the cry of "Huzza for Otaheite" was ever uttered. If this island had been the object of either Christian or the crew, they would not have left it 300 miles behind them before they perpetrated the act of piracy, but after the deed had been committed it would be natural enough that they should turn their minds to the lovely island and its fascinating inhabitants, which they had but just quitted, and that in the moment of excitement some of them should have so called out, but Bligh is the only person who has said they did so. If, however, the recollection of the sunny isle and its smiling women had really tempted the men to mutiny, Bligh would himself not be free from blame, for having allowed them to indulge for 6 whole months among this voluptuous and fascinating people, for though he was one of the most active and anxious commanders of his time, the service, as is observed by a naval officer, was carried on in those days in a very different spirit from that which regulates its movements now, otherwise the Bounty would never have passed 6 whole months at one island, stowing away the fruit, during which time the officers and seamen had free access to the shore. Under similar circumstances nowadays, if the fruit happened not to be ready, the ship would have been off, after 10 days' relaxation, to survey other islands, or speculate on coral reefs, or make astronomical observations; in short, to do something or other to keep the devil out of the heads of the crew.
Note 8.
Bligh would appear to have been sensible of this on his next expedition in the Providence, for on that occasion he collected more breadfruit plants than on the former, and spent only half the time in doing so. Be that as it may, Bligh might naturally enough conclude that the seamen were casting a lingering look behind towards Otaheite. If, says Forster, who accompanied Cook, we fairly consider the different situations of a common sailor on board the Resolution and of a Tahitian on his island, we cannot blame the former if he attempted to rid himself of the numberless discomforts of a voyage round the world, and prefer an easy life, free from cares, in the happiest climate of the world, to the frequent vicissitudes which are entailed upon the mariner. The most favourable prospects of future success in England, which he might form an idea, could never be so flattering to his senses as the lowly hope of living like the meanest Tahitian. And supposing him to escape the misfortunes incident to seamen, Still he must earn his subsistence in England at the expense of labour, and in the sweat of his brow, when the oldest curse on mankind is scarcely felt at Tahiti. 2 or 3 breadfruit trees, which grow almost without any culture, and which flourish as long as he himself can expect to live, supply him with abundant food during 3/4 of the year. The cloth trees and eddo roots are cultivated with much less trouble than are cabbages and kitchen herbs. The banana, the royal palm, the golden apple, all thrive with such luxuriance, and require so little trouble, that I may venture to call them spontaneous. Most of their days are therefore spent in a round of various enjoyments, where nature has lavished many a pleasing landscape, where the temperature of the air is warm, but continually refreshed by a wholesome breeze from the sea, and where the sky is almost constantly serene. A kind of happy uniformity runs through the whole life of the Tahitians. They rise with the sun, and hasten to rivers and fountains to perform an ablution equally reviving and cleaning. They pass the morning at work, or walk about till the heat of the day increases, when they retreat to their dwellings, or repose under some tufted tree. There they amuse themselves with smoothing their hair, and anointing it with fragrant oils, or they blow the flute, or sing to it, or listen to the songs of the birds. At the hour of noon, or a little later, they go to dinner. After their meals they resume domestic amusements, during which the flame of mutual affection spreads in every heart, and unites the rising generation with new and tender ties. The lively jest, without any ill nature, the artless tale, the jocund dance, and frugal supper, bring on the evening, and another visit to the river concludes the actions of the day. Thus contented with their simple way of life, and placed in a delightful country, they are free from cares, and happy in their ignorance. Such is the picture drawn of the happy people of Otaheite by a cold philosophical German doctor, and such with very little change Bligh found them. As far, however, as the mutiny of his people was concerned, we must wholly discard the idea thrown out by him, that the seductions of Otaheite had any share in producing it. It could not have escaped a person of Christian sagacity that certain interrogatories would unquestionably be put by the natives of Otaheite on finding the ship return so soon without her commander, without the breadfruit plants, and with only about half her crew; questions he knew to which no satisfactory answer could be made, and though, at subsequent periods, he twice visited that island, it was some time afterwards, and not from choice but necessity. His object was to find a place of concealment, where he might pass the remainder of his days, unheard of and unknown, and where it is to be hoped he had time for sincere repentance, the only atonement he could make for the commission of a crime which involved so many human beings in misery, and brought others to an untimely end. But of this hereafter. End of chapter 3.